The metal gate exploded open with a thunderous clang that echoed through the Lazy E arena like a gunshot. 20-year-old Brent Ellis felt Bonecrusher's massive body beneath him surge forward with the force of a freight train. Every muscle in the 2,000-pound bull coiled with rage and power. The crowd's roar became a distant hum as adrenaline flooded his system. 1 second. Brent's left hand gripped the bull rope with everything he had, his knuckles white beneath his riding glove. Bonecrusher twisted violently to the right, his hooves pounding against the arena dirt like thunder. The young rider felt his body whip sideways, fighting to maintain his seat as the bull's massive shoulders rolled beneath him. 2 seconds. The bull spun counterclockwise, a move that had fooled dozens of riders before Brent. His free arm flew wildly as he tried to maintain balance, but Bonecrusher was already 3 moves ahead. The bull's head dropped low between his front legs, and his hindquarters kicked skyward with devastating force. 3 seconds. In that moment, time seemed to freeze. Brent felt himself losing the battle against gravity and 1,200 pounds of pure fury. His grip failed. His body launched forward, spinning through the air like a rag doll. The arena lights above became a blur of white and shadow as he flew toward the metal panels that enclosed the riding area. The impact was sickening. Brent's body struck the steel barrier with a hollow thud that cut through the crowd's cheers like a blade. His head snapped back against the unforgiving metal, and consciousness fled from him instantly. He crumpled to the dirt, motionless, his protective vest torn and his face already beginning to swell. But Bonecrusher wasn't finished. The bull, still in full rage mode, wheeled around and spotted the fallen rider. In the world of professional bull riding, this was every cowboy's nightmare. Being unconscious in the arena with 2,000 pounds of angry beef still in play. The rodeo clowns were moving, but they were too far away. The pickup men on horseback were spurring their mounts forward, but the distance was too great. Bonecrusher's hooves, each one the size of dinner plates, came down on Brent's motionless form with devastating force. Once. Twice. The sickening sound of impact echoed through the suddenly quiet arena as 20,000 spectators held their breath in horror. Sarah Ellis screamed from Section C, her voice cutting through the stunned silence like broken glass. Her hands clutched the metal railing in front of her so tightly that her knuckles went white, and her 16-year-old daughter Emma grabbed her arm, both of them watching in helpless terror as the medical team rushed into the arena. "Get him off! Get that bull off my boy!" Sarah's voice cracked with desperation as she tried to climb over the railing, only to be held back by the spectators around her. The rodeo clowns finally reached Bonecrusher, using every trick they knew to distract the bull and draw him away from the motionless rider. Barrel man Jerry Wildfire, Watson threw himself between the bull and Brent's body, his colorful costume a stark contrast to the horror unfolding in the dirt. The bull charged him, missing by inches as Jerry dove behind his protective barrel. Meanwhile, bullfighter Mike Torres approached from the opposite side, waving his arms and shouting to get Bonecrusher's attention. The bull, finally distracted from his unconscious victim, turned toward this new target. Mike backpedaled quickly, leading the massive animal toward the exit gate where the pickup men waited to guide him back to the holding pens. Dr. Amanda Harrison, the arena's head physician, was already sliding under the bottom rail before Bonecrusher was fully clear of the area. She'd seen plenty of injuries in her 10 years of rodeo medicine, but the sight that greeted her made her stomach drop. Brent lay unnaturally still, blood seeping from a head wound and mixing with the arena dirt. His breathing was shallow and irregular, and his left leg was bent at an angle that made her fear the worst. "We need a backboard and oxygen now," she shouted to her medical team as she knelt beside the fallen rider. Her fingers found his pulse, weak but present, and she began her assessment with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd dealt with trauma in rodeo arenas from Texas to Montana. Jake Morrison, the veteran rider who'd been mentoring Brent, vaulted over the fence and ran toward the scene. His own riding boots slipped in the loose dirt as he approached, and what he saw made his blood run cold. In 15 years of competition, he'd witnessed plenty of wrecks, but this one felt different. This one felt final. "Is he?" Jake couldn't finish the question as he watched Dr. Harrison work. The young rider who'd been joking with him just minutes earlier now looked impossibly small and fragile against the vastness of the arena floor. "He's alive, but we need to get him out of here immediately," Dr. Harrison replied without looking up. Her hands moved quickly, checking for spinal injuries while her team prepared the stretcher. "Someone call life flight. We're going to need air transport." The arena had fallen into an eerie silence that felt unnatural after the earlier excitement. 20,000 people sat in stunned quiet, watching as the medical team worked to stabilize the motionless cowboy. The only sounds were the occasional shout from the medical personnel and the distant lowing of cattle in the holding pens. Up in the stands, Sarah Ellis had gone pale as paper. Emma held her mother's hand as they watched the scene below, both of them praying silently for some sign of movement from Brent. Around them, other spectators whispered among themselves, many of them parents who understood the terror Sarah was experiencing. "He's gonna be okay, Mama," Emma whispered, though her voice shook with uncertainty. "Remember when he fell off Thunder last year, and we thought he was hurt bad? He was fine then, and he'll be fine now." But Sarah had been around rodeo long enough to know the difference between a regular fall and what they'd just witnessed. The way Brent had hit that metal barrier, the sound it had made, the way he'd gone completely limp. These were the details that haunted the nightmares of every rodeo family. Tom Ellis was 60 miles away at their ranch outside Stillwater, completely unaware that his son was fighting for his life in an Oklahoma City arena. He was in the barn, tending to their sick bull, when his cell phone started ringing. The number was Sarah's, but when he answered, it was Emma's voice that greeted him, broken and frightened. "Dad, you need to get to the hospital in Oklahoma City right now. Brent, there was an accident." The phone slipped from Tom's weathered hands and clattered onto the barn floor as the full weight of his daughter's words hit him. For a moment, he stood frozen in the yellow light of the barn's single bulb, unable to process what he'd just heard. Then training and instinct kicked in, and he was running toward his truck, his boots pounding against the gravel driveway. Back at the arena, the Life Flight helicopter was settling onto the parking lot outside, its rotors whipping up dust and debris as the medical crew prepared for the most critical transport of their careers. Dr. Harrison supervised every aspect of Brent's transfer from the arena to the aircraft, her trained eye watching for any sign of deterioration in his condition. "Massive head trauma, possible spinal injury, internal bleeding probable," she reported to the flight crew as they loaded the stretcher into the helicopter. 20-year-old male, previously healthy, took a direct hit from a 2,000-pound bull. The helicopter lifted off into the Oklahoma night sky, its lights disappearing toward the trauma center as Sarah and Emma made their own desperate drive through the empty highways. The arena was slowly emptying, but the image of Brent Ellis lying motionless in the dirt would stay with every person who'd witnessed it. In the holding pens behind the arena, Bonecrusher had settled into his usual calm demeanor, as if nothing had happened. The bull showed no signs of the rage that had nearly killed a young man just minutes earlier. To him, it had simply been another ride, another cowboy who'd failed to stay on his back for 8 seconds. But for Brent Ellis, those 3 seconds had changed everything. 6 months earlier, the Ellis family ranch had been facing its worst financial crisis in 3 generations. The drought that had gripped Oklahoma for 2 consecutive summers had devastated their pastures, forcing them to buy expensive hay to feed their cattle herd. Medical bills for their livestock continued to mount, and the bank had started making increasingly uncomfortable calls about their overdue mortgage payments. Brent had been working double shifts at the local feed store in Stillwater while training for his professional bull rider's license, sending every spare dollar home to help keep the ranch afloat. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was selling feed they couldn't afford to buy, watching other ranchers purchase the supplies his family desperately needed. "I'm telling you, son, there's got to be another way," Tom Ellis had said on a sweltering July evening as they sat on the front porch of their farmhouse. The paint was peeling from the wooden siding, and the screen door hung slightly crooked on its hinges, small details that spoke to bigger financial problems. Bull riding's dangerous enough when you're doing it for love. When you're doing it for money, that's when cowboys get killed. But Brent had already made up his mind. At the county fair rodeo 3 weeks earlier, he'd watched Jake Morrison win $15,000 for 8 seconds of work, and the math was simple enough. A few good rides could solve their immediate problems and buy them time to turn the ranch around. "Dad, I've been riding bulls since I was 14. I'm good at this." "Really good," Brent had argued, gesturing toward the barn where his practice equipment was set up. "Jake thinks I've got what it takes to make it to the national finals. That's life-changing money we're talking about." Sarah Ellis had listened to this conversation from the kitchen window, her heart breaking a little more with each word. She'd married into the rodeo life and understood its appeal, but she'd also seen too many young men carried out of arenas on stretchers. The fact that her own son was now talking about risking his life for prize money made her feel like she was failing him somehow. The Ellis Ranch sat on 200 acres of rolling Oklahoma prairie, land that had been in Tom's family since his grandfather homesteaded it in the 1920s. The main house was a modest two-story structure with a wraparound porch that faced west toward the setting sun. The barn, corrals, and outbuildings showed the wear and tear of nearly a century of use, but they were solid and functional. Emma Ellis, at 16, was the practical one in the family. While Brent dreamed of rodeo glory and their parents worried about keeping the ranch, she focused on her grades and her part-time job at the local diner. She'd already earned a partial academic scholarship to Oklahoma State University and had plans that extended far beyond the county lines. "You know what I think?" Emma had said during one of their family discussions about money. "I think we're all being stubborn. Maybe it's time to sell some of the land to that developer who's been calling. Brent doesn't have to risk his neck for prize money if we're not so proud that we can't make some changes." The suggestion had fallen on deaf ears. Tom Ellis would rather lose everything than sell even an acre of land that his grandfather had fought to keep during the Great Depression. And Brent saw bull riding as a way to save the ranch without compromising its legacy. Training had consumed Brent's life throughout that summer. Every morning before his shift at the feed store, he'd practice on the mechanical bull that Jake Morrison had helped him set up in their barn. The machine wasn't nearly as unpredictable as a real bull, but it helped him work on his balance, his grip, and his ability to read the rhythm of a bucking animal. Jake had become more than just a mentor. He'd become the older brother Brent never had. The veteran rider had grown up poor in Texas and understood the financial pressures that drove young men to take risks in the arena. He'd also seen too many promising careers ended by preventable injuries, which made him cautious about encouraging anyone to turn professional before they were truly ready. "The thing about bulls," Jake had explained during one of their training sessions, "is that they're not trying to hurt you. They just want you off their backs, and they'll do whatever it takes to make that happen. The ones that scare me aren't the ones that buck hard. Those are predictable. It's the ones like Bonecrusher that think 3 moves ahead that'll get you in trouble." Bonecrusher had been making a name for himself on the circuit that summer. The massive Brahma bull had been bred specifically for bucking, with bloodlines that traced back to some of the most successful rodeo stock in the country. His owner, Circle R Ranch, had paid nearly $50,000 for him as a yearling, and he'd more than justified the investment. The bull's reputation grew with each event. Riders who managed to stay on him for the full 8 seconds were rare, and those who did often found themselves with scores in the high 80s or low 90s, the kind of numbers that won events and built careers. But for every successful ride, there were 3 or 4 that ended with cowboys in the dirt, and several that ended with trips to the hospital. "He's got this move where he'll spin to the right for 2 seconds, then reverse direction so fast it'll snap your neck if you're not ready for it," Jake had warned Brent. "Most bulls have patterns you can learn, but Bonecrusher seems to change his game plan every time out of the gate." The opportunity to face Bonecrusher had come unexpectedly. Originally, Brent was scheduled to ride a much less dangerous bull named Tornado Alley at the Lazy E Arena event. But when another rider was injured in practice, the draw was reshuffled, and Brent found himself matched against the bull that every cowboy on the circuit both feared and respected. Sarah Ellis had begged him to withdraw from the event when she learned about the change. The night before the rodeo, she'd sat him down at their kitchen table. The same table where 3 generations of Ellis family decisions had been made, and tried one last time to talk sense into her son. "Brent, honey, I know you think you're doing this for us, but we'd rather lose the ranch than lose you," she'd said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "Your daddy and we've had our time here. But you've got your whole life ahead of you. Don't throw that away for money." But Brent's mind was made up. He'd calculated that a successful 8-second ride on Bonecrusher would earn him enough prize money to make their next 3 mortgage payments and buy them the breathing room they needed. He'd also convinced himself that his youth and athleticism gave him advantages that older riders didn't have. The morning of the event, Tom Ellis had driven his son to Oklahoma City in their aging pickup truck. The drive normally took about an hour, but they'd made it in 45 minutes, neither of them speaking much along the way. Both men knew this could be a defining moment for their family, though neither wanted to acknowledge how much was riding on 8 seconds of rodeo action. "You remember what I taught you about reading a bull's body language?" Tom had asked as they pulled into the arena parking lot. Despite his fears about his son's chosen profession, Tom had been a rodeo competitor himself and understood the technical aspects of bull riding better than most parents. "Keep my weight centered, watch his head for direction changes, and never fight the bull. Go with his momentum and use it to stay balanced. Brent had recited the advice he'd heard hundreds of times. The pre-event routine at the Lazy E Arena was familiar to anyone who'd spent time around professional rodeo. Riders arrived early to inspect their equipment, meet with the event coordinators, and get a look at the bulls they'd be facing. The atmosphere was always a mixture of nervous energy and professional camaraderie, as cowboys who competed against each other also supported one another through the dangers they all faced. Brent had spent an hour studying Bonecrusher from outside the holding pens, watching the bull's behavior and trying to anticipate his patterns. The massive animal seemed calm enough in his pen, but experienced riders knew that bulls could transform completely once they entered the arena environment. "He's bigger than I expected," Brent had admitted to Jake as they watched the bull from a safe distance. "The videos don't really show you how massive he is. That's what makes him so dangerous," Jake had replied. "Most bulls that size are too heavy to be really athletic. But Bonecrusher moves like he weighs half what he actually does. It's like riding a freight train that thinks it's a sports car." The hours before the event had passed quickly. Brent had gone through his pre-ride ritual, checking and rechecking his equipment, stretching and warming up his muscles, and trying to visualize a successful 8-second ride. The familiar routine helped calm his nerves and focus his mind on the task ahead. Sarah and Emma had arrived at the arena 2 hours before the event started, both of them trying to hide their anxiety behind forced smiles and normal conversation. They'd found their seats in Section C, close enough to the action to see everything clearly, but far enough away to feel somewhat safe from the chaos that was about to unfold. "I wish Grandpa could be here to see this," Emma had said as they settled into their seats. "He always said Brent had the natural balance to be a great rider." Sarah had nodded, though privately she wished her father-in-law was still alive to talk some sense into his grandson. The old man had given up bull riding after a career-ending injury in 1967, and he'd always warned about the long-term costs of chasing rodeo dreams. As the evening progressed and the event drew closer, the arena began to fill with spectators. Friday night rodeos at the Lazy E were popular throughout Oklahoma, drawing crowds from rural communities where rodeo was still considered the ultimate test of courage and skill. The energy in the building was infectious, with country music playing over the sound system and the smell of arena dirt mixing with concession stand food. Behind the chutes, Brent had gone through his final preparations. His riding glove was secured, his protective vest was properly fitted, and his bull rope was ready for the most important 8 seconds of his young life. Everything he'd worked for, everything his family needed, would come down to his ability to stay on Bonecrusher's back while the massive bull did everything in his power to remove him. The moment was approaching when everything would change forever, though none of them realized it yet. In just a few more minutes, the gate would open, and 3 seconds later, the Ellis family's world would be shattered in ways they couldn't imagine. If the story already moved you, subscribe to the channel and leave your like to not miss any of our stories. The trauma bay at Oklahoma University Medical Center erupted into controlled chaos as the Life Flight helicopter settled onto the hospital's rooftop landing pad. Dr. Rachel Martinez, the night shift trauma surgeon, had been briefed about the incoming patient during the flight, but nothing could fully prepare her for what she saw when Brent Ellis was wheeled through the emergency department doors. The young cowboy's face was swollen beyond recognition, blood matted in his dark hair where his head had struck the metal barrier. His breathing was assisted by a ventilator that had been inserted during the helicopter flight, and the multiple monitors attached to his body painted a grim picture of his condition. Most concerning was his Glasgow Coma Scale score of 3, the lowest possible rating, indicating no response to stimuli. "What do we have?" Dr. Martinez asked as she fell into step beside the gurney, her experienced eyes taking in every detail of Brent's condition. At 38, she'd seen hundreds of trauma cases, but rodeo injuries always hit her differently. There was something particularly tragic about young people being destroyed while pursuing their dreams. 20-year-old male, direct impact with metal barrier followed by trampling, reported Dr. Harrison, who'd accompanied the patient from the arena. Massive head trauma, possible basilar skull fracture, probable internal bleeding. He's been unconscious since impact approximately 45 minutes ago. The trauma team moved with practiced precision as they transferred Brent into Trauma Bay 3. Within minutes, additional 4 lines were established, blood samples were drawn for typing and cross-matching, and a portable CT scanner was being wheeled into position. Every second counted when dealing with traumatic brain injury, and Dr. Martinez knew they were already racing against time. "Get me a neuroconsult down here immediately," she ordered one of the residents. "And I want her too prepped for emergency surgery. If these scans show what I think they're going to show, we'll need to relieve intracranial pressure as soon as possible." Meanwhile, Tom Ellis was pushing his pickup truck to its limits on the dark highways between Stillwater and Oklahoma City. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles had gone white, and he'd made the normally hour-long drive in just over 40 minutes. Emma's phone call kept replaying in his mind, each word hitting him like a physical blow. The ranch he'd been willing to lose everything to save suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the possibility of losing his son. The cattle, the land, the family legacy, none of it mattered if Brent didn't survive the night. Tom had spent his entire adult life making practical decisions based on financial realities, but now he found himself bargaining with whatever higher power might be listening. At the hospital, Sarah Ellis paced the waiting room like a caged animal, unable to sit still despite Emma's repeated attempts to get her to rest. The antiseptic smell of the hospital and the harsh fluorescent lighting made everything feel surreal, as if she were trapped in some kind of nightmare from which she couldn't wake up. "Mrs. Ellis?" A voice interrupted her thoughts, and she turned to see a young resident in scrubs approaching. "I'm Dr. Patterson. I wanted to update you on your son's condition." Sarah felt Emma grab her arm for support as Dr. Patterson continued. "Brent has suffered severe traumatic brain injury from the impact. We're currently running CT scans to determine the exact extent of the damage, but I want you to be prepared. His condition is critical." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. She'd prepared herself for broken bones, torn ligaments, the kinds of injuries that ended rodeo careers but left young men with their lives intact. But traumatic brain injury was different. That was the kind of damage that changed people forever, if they survived at all. "Can we see him?" Emma asked, her voice smaller than Sarah had ever heard it. At 16, Emma had always been the strong one in the family, the practical daughter who kept everyone grounded. But now she looked like the frightened child she'd never had to be before. "Not yet," Dr. Patterson replied gently. "He's being prepped for emergency surgery. Dr. Martinez is one of the best trauma surgeons in the state. If anyone can help him, she can." Back in Trauma Bay 3, the CT scan results confirmed Dr. Martinez's worst fears. Brent had suffered a massive subdural hematoma, bleeding between his brain and skull that was creating dangerous pressure on his brain tissue. Without immediate surgical intervention to relieve that pressure, the young rider would almost certainly die within the next few hours. "Or 2 is ready," announced Jackie Williams, the head surgical nurse who'd worked with Dr. Martinez for over 5 years. Jackie had seen her share of trauma cases, but something about this young cowboy's situation had gotten under her skin. Maybe it was his age, or maybe it was the way his mother had looked when they'd brought him in, the expression of a parent watching her worst nightmare unfold. Dr. Martinez nodded and began scrubbing for what she knew would be one of the most challenging surgeries of her career. Emergency craniotomy, the surgical removal of part of the skull to relieve pressure on the brain, was always risky, but on a patient with Brent's extent of injuries, it was their only hope. Tom Ellis burst through the hospital's main entrance at 11:47 p.m., his work clothes still carrying the scent of hay and cattle from the ranch. He found Sarah and Emma in the surgical waiting area, both of them looking smaller and more fragile than he'd ever seen them. The sight of his wife's tear-streaked face hit him harder than any physical blow he'd ever taken. "How is he?" Tom asked, though the expressions on their faces already told him most of what he needed to know. "Surgery," Sarah managed to whisper. "They said there's bleeding in his brain. They have to." She couldn't finish the sentence, but Tom understood. After 22 years of marriage and a lifetime around rodeo, they could communicate without words when words became too painful. The Ellis family settled in for what they knew would be the longest wait of their lives. The surgical waiting area at OU Medical Center was designed to be comfortable, with soft lighting and cushioned chairs, but no amount of interior design could ease the anxiety that filled the space. Other families sat in similar vigil, all of them connected by the terrible uncertainty that comes with having a loved one in surgery. Emma tried to distract herself by reading the magazines scattered on the waiting room tables, but the words blurred together as her mind kept returning to the scene she'd witnessed at the arena. She couldn't stop seeing her brother's motionless body in the dirt, couldn't unhear the sound he'd made when he hit that metal barrier. At 16, she was discovering that some images become permanently burned into memory. Dr. Martinez worked with the focused intensity that had made her one of the region's most respected trauma surgeons. The emergency craniotomy required her to remove a section of Brent's skull to access the bleeding vessels beneath. Under the bright lights of OR2, she could see the full extent of the damage that Bonecrusher's hooves and the metal barrier had inflicted on the young rider's brain. "Pressure's dropping," announced the anesthesiologist, Dr. Kim Patel, who'd been monitoring Brent's vital signs throughout the procedure. "That's a good sign. We're giving his brain room to breathe." But even as they relieved the immediate pressure, Dr. Martinez could see areas of damaged brain tissue that would never function normally again. The full extent of Brent's cognitive damage wouldn't be known for days or weeks, but she could already tell that the young man who'd entered the arena that evening would never be the same person who eventually left the hospital. "How much longer?" asked surgical technician Mike Rodriguez, who'd been assisting with the procedure. Mike had worked in trauma surgery for 8 years and had developed an ability to read the subtle signs that indicated how a surgery was progressing. "Another hour at least," Dr. Martinez replied without looking up from her work. "I want to make sure we've controlled all the bleeding before we close. This young man's only going to get one chance at this." In the waiting room, Jake Morrison had arrived to sit with the Ellis family. The veteran rider had left the arena as soon as the event ended, still wearing his competition clothes and carrying the weight of guilt that came with surviving when younger riders didn't. He'd seen plenty of wrecks in his 15-year career, but watching Brent get trampled by Bonecrusher had shaken him more than he cared to admit. "This isn't your fault," Tom Ellis said quietly, recognizing the expression on Jake's weathered face. "Brent made his own choice to get on that bull. Nobody forced him." But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he should have done more to prepare the young rider for what he was facing. Bonecrusher wasn't just any bull. He was a career-ender, a cow that had hospitalized more riders than any other animal currently on the circuit. Maybe Jake should have been more direct about the risks, more insistent that Brent wait until he had more experience before taking on such a dangerous draw. "He was so excited about tonight," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This morning he was talking about using the prize money to fix the barn roof. Such a simple thing, a barn roof, and now—" She didn't finish the sentence, but everyone in the waiting room understood. The financial problems that had seemed so important that morning now felt trivial compared to the question of whether Brent would survive the night. The ranch, the mortgage payments, the medical bills for their cattle, all of it had been rendered meaningless by 3 seconds in an Oklahoma City arena. As the hours passed, other rodeo families began arriving at the hospital. Word had spread quickly through the tight-knit community of professional bull riders, and even competitors who barely knew Brent felt compelled to show their support. The waiting room filled with cowboys still wearing their competition clothes, their wives and girlfriends, and longtime rodeo followers who understood that every rider's tragedy belonged to all of them. Dr. Martinez finally emerged from surgery at 2:30 a.m., still wearing her surgical scrubs and the exhausted expression of someone who'd just spent 3 hours fighting to save a young man's life. The Ellis family rose as one when they saw her approaching, their faces desperate for any news that might offer hope. "The surgery went as well as we could have hoped," Dr. Martinez began, choosing her words carefully. "We were able to relieve the pressure on his brain and control the bleeding. That's the good news." She paused, and in that pause, the Ellis family heard everything they needed to know about the challenges that lay ahead. "But I have to be honest with you, Brent has suffered severe traumatic brain injury. He's stable for now, but he remains in a coma, and we won't know the full extent of his neurological damage for some time. The next 72 hours will be critical." The words hung in the air like smoke, filling the space between hope and despair. Brent was alive, but the person he'd been before stepping into that arena might be gone forever. The Ellis family was beginning to understand that some victories feel exactly like defeats. 3 weeks after the accident, Brent Ellis lay motionless in bed 7 of the neurological intensive care unit, surrounded by machines that breathed for him, fed him, and monitored every biological function his damaged brain could no longer coordinate. The swelling in his head had finally subsided enough for doctors to begin assessing the true extent of his injuries, and the news had been devastating. Dr. Martinez sat across from the Ellis family in a small conference room adjacent to the ICU, a manila folder full of test results and brain scans spread across the table between them. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed quietly, the only sound in a room that had become all too familiar over the past 3 weeks. "The good news is that Brent is breathing on his own now," Dr. Martinez began, her voice gentle but clinical. "We removed the ventilator yesterday, and his lung function appears to be normal. However, the brain scans show extensive damage to areas that control motor function, speech, and higher cognitive processes." Sarah Ellis had aged years in the past 3 weeks. The vibrant woman who'd watched her son ride bulls with nervous pride had been replaced by someone who looked hollow, as if the life had been drained out of her along with her son's consciousness. She held Tom's hand across the table, both of them trying to process information that seemed impossible to accept. "What does that mean exactly?" Tom asked, his voice hoarse from too many sleepless nights in hospital waiting rooms. "Are you saying he's never going to wake up?" Dr. Martinez shook her head slowly. "He might regain consciousness. Some patients with similar injuries do wake up after weeks or even months in a coma. But even if Brent does wake up, he's likely to face significant challenges. The damage to his frontal lobe suggests he may have difficulty with memory, decision-making, and impulse control. The motor cortex damage means he'll probably have limited mobility and coordination." Emma Ellis, now 17 and carrying responsibilities no teenager should have to bear, spoke up from her corner of the room. "Are you saying he might not remember us? That he might not be himself?" "It's possible," Dr. Martinez admitted. "Traumatic brain injury affects different people in different ways. Some patients recover more function than we expect, while others—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. They all understood that some patients never recovered at all. The financial reality of Brent's condition was becoming as overwhelming as the medical one. Their insurance covered the emergency surgery and initial treatment, but the long-term care he would need could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. The ranch that Brent had been trying to save was now facing an even more impossible situation, with medical bills piling up alongside their existing debts. Jake Morrison had become a regular visitor to the ICU, stopping by every few days to sit with Brent and talk to him as if the young rider could hear every word. The doctors had mentioned that coma patients sometimes responded to familiar voices, and Jake felt compelled to try anything that might help bring his young protégé back from wherever his mind had retreated. "Hey there, partner," Jake would say, settling into the uncomfortable visitor's chair beside Brent's bed. "Bonecrusher's been asking about you." "Well, not really, but I like to think he feels bad about what happened. Bulls don't usually mean to hurt anyone, they just want us off their backs." The young man in the bed showed no sign of hearing these one-sided conversations, but Jake continued them anyway. He'd tell Brent about the other riders on the circuit, about upcoming events, about anything that might penetrate whatever darkness had claimed the 20-year-old's mind. The rodeo community had rallied around the Ellis family in ways that both surprised and humbled them. A benefit fund had been established to help with medical expenses, and events across Oklahoma and Texas were donating portions of their prize money to help cover Brent's care. Cowboys who'd never met the Ellis family were contributing whatever they could, understanding that Brent's accident could have happened to any of them. "It's amazing how people are stepping up," Sarah told her sister during one of their phone conversations. "Riders from all over the country are sending money, and some of the stock contractors are organizing special events just to raise funds for Brent's care." But even with the community support, the long-term financial picture remained daunting. Specialized rehabilitation facilities cost thousands of dollars per week, and there was no guarantee that even the best care would restore any meaningful function to Brent's damaged brain. Dr. Lisa Chun, the neurologist who'd taken over Brent's care, had been cautiously optimistic about some recent developments. Small changes in his brain activity had been detected on EEG monitoring, suggesting that some level of consciousness might be returning. It wasn't much, but for a family living on hope, even tiny improvements felt monumental. "We're seeing some response to painful stimuli," Dr. Chin explained during one of their weekly meetings. "It's not much, but it suggests that his brain is beginning to process sensory input again. This could be the first step toward regaining consciousness." Tom Ellis had taken a leave of absence from the ranch to spend time at the hospital, leaving their neighbor Charlie Henderson to look after the cattle. Charlie, a lifelong friend who understood the Ellis family's situation, had refused any payment for his help, insisting that neighbors took care of each other during difficult times. The reality of potentially losing the ranch was becoming more concrete each day. Without Brent's income from the feed store and with mounting medical bills, they were falling further behind on their mortgage payments. The bank had been patient so far, but patience had limits, even in small-town Oklahoma where everyone knew everyone else's business. "Maybe it's time to consider selling," Emma suggested during one of their family discussions in the hospital cafeteria. I know it goes against everything we believe in, but Brent's care has to be the priority now. Grandpa would understand. Tom struggled with the suggestion, even though he knew Emma was probably right. The Ellis Ranch represented 4 generations of family history, but keeping it wouldn't matter if they couldn't afford to keep Brent alive and give him whatever chance he had for recovery. On a Thursday afternoon in late November, nearly 6 weeks after the accident, Sarah was reading aloud from one of Brent's favorite books when she noticed something different. His eyes, which had been closed or unfocused for weeks, seemed to track her movement as she shifted in her chair. "Brent," she whispered, hardly daring to hope. "Can you hear me, honey?" For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly and with obvious effort, Brent's eyes focused on her face. His mouth opened as if he were trying to speak, but no sound emerged. Still, it was the first voluntary response they'd seen since the night of the accident. Sarah pressed the call button and tried to keep her voice calm as she spoke to her son. "That's it, baby. I'm right here. You're in the hospital, but you're going to be okay. We're all here with you." Dr. Chen arrived within minutes, conducting a series of simple tests to assess Brent's level of consciousness. He could track objects with his eyes and seemed to respond to simple commands, though his movements were slow and unsteady. Most encouraging was his apparent recognition of family members, suggesting that his long-term memory had survived the trauma. "This is very encouraging," Dr. Chen told the family after completing her examination. "He's definitely regaining consciousness, though we won't know the full extent of his cognitive function for some time. The fact that he recognizes you is a very good sign." Over the following days, Brent's awareness continued to improve gradually. He began attempting to speak, though his words were slurred and often incomprehensible. Physical therapy sessions revealed severe weakness on his left side, and occupational therapy showed significant problems with fine motor control and coordination. The young man who'd once balanced effortlessly on the backs of 2,000-pound bulls now struggled to hold a plastic cup or feed himself with a spoon. Simple tasks that he'd never thought about before, brushing his teeth, combing his hair, getting dressed, had become monumental challenges that required intense concentration and assistance. "I don't remember," became Brent's most frequent phrase as he struggled to piece together the events that had led to his hospitalization. He remembered growing up on the ranch, remembered learning to ride bulls, remembered his family and friends. But the weeks leading up to his accident remained a blur, and many recent memories seemed to have been permanently erased. Jake Morrison was present for one of Brent's first attempts at a real conversation, and the change in his young friend was heartbreaking. The confident, ambitious young rider had been replaced by someone who seemed confused and frustrated by his own limitations. "Hey, Jake," Brent managed to say, his speech slow and deliberate. Why am I here? What happened to me?" Jake had dreaded this moment, knowing he'd eventually have to explain the accident to someone who couldn't remember it. How do you tell a young man that his dreams had been destroyed in 3 seconds, that his life had been permanently altered by a bull named Bonecrusher? "You had an accident, partner," Jake said gently. "At the rodeo. You drew a tough bull, and things didn't go the way we planned." Brent nodded slowly, as if trying to process information that didn't quite make sense to his damaged brain. Am I going to be okay?" The question hung in the air like smoke, impossible to answer honestly without destroying whatever hope remained. Jake chose his words carefully, knowing that Brent's recovery would depend partly on his own belief in the possibility of getting better. "You're going to be different," Jake said finally. "But different doesn't mean you can't have a good life. It just means we've got to figure out what that life looks like now." The conversation exhausted Brent, and he drifted back into sleep within minutes. But for the Ellis family, it represented a milestone they'd feared they might never reach. Their son was alive, he was conscious, and he remembered who they were. It wasn't the recovery they'd hoped for, but it was a foundation they could build on. As winter settled over Oklahoma and the first anniversary of Brent's accident approached, the Ellis family was learning to navigate their new reality. The ranch had been sold to cover medical expenses, with Charlie Henderson purchasing it at a fair price and promising to keep the Ellis family on as managers. It wasn't the same as owning their ancestral land, but it allowed them to stay in the community they'd always called home. Brent had been transferred to a rehabilitation facility in Oklahoma City, where he was working with therapists to regain as much function as possible. Progress was slow and often frustrating, but small victories, speaking a complete sentence clearly, walking across a room without assistance, remembering an event from the previous day, provided hope that continued improvement was possible. The young man who'd once dreamed of rodeo stardom was learning new dreams. He'd never ride bulls again, might never drive a car or live independently, but he was discovering that survival itself could be a form of victory. Every day he woke up, every conversation he had with his family, every small improvement in his condition was a triumph over the 3 seconds that had nearly destroyed him. Sarah Ellis had returned to work at the local school district, and Emma had enrolled at Oklahoma State University on her academic scholarship. Tom continued managing the ranch for its new owners, finding purpose in maintaining the land that had been in his family for 4 generations, even if he no longer owned it. Jake Morrison visited less frequently as the rodeo season continued and his travel schedule intensified, but he made sure to stay in touch. The veteran rider had quietly established a scholarship fund for young bull riders, emphasizing safety training and providing financial support so that fewer cowboys would feel pressured to take unnecessary risks for prize money. On a warm spring afternoon, almost a year after the accident, Brent Ellis sat on the porch of the ranch house he'd grown up in, watching the cattle graze in pastures his family had once owned. His speech had improved considerably, though it remained slower than before his injury. His mobility was limited, and he required assistance with many daily tasks. But he was alive and aware, and surrounded by people who loved him. "Do you miss it?" Emma asked, settling into the chair beside him. She was home from college for the weekend, and these quiet conversations with her brother had become precious to both of them. Brent considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I miss who I was going to be," he said finally. "But I'm learning to like who I am now. It's different, but it's not bad different. Just different." The young man who'd once measured his worth in 8-second intervals was discovering that recovery could be measured in much smaller increments. Speaking clearly, walking steadily, remembering yesterday's events. These had become his new victories, less spectacular than rodeo success but no less meaningful. Bonecrusher continued competing on the professional circuit, his reputation growing with each event. The bull that had changed the Ellis family's life forever went about his business of bucking off cowboys, unaware of the permanent consequences of one particular ride. In the world of professional bull riding, he was just doing his job, the same way he had the night he'd encountered Brent Ellis at the Lazy Arena. But for Brent, his family, and everyone who'd witnessed that 3-second collision between dreams and reality, Bonecrusher represented something more complex. Not evil or malicious, just the unpredictable force that reminded everyone that some risks carry consequences too severe to undo. As the sun set over the Oklahoma prairie, casting long shadows across land that no longer belonged to the Ellis family but would always be their home, Brent reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was the life he'd been given, and he was learning that survival, true survival, meant more than just staying alive. It meant finding new ways to be whole, new reasons to hope, and new definitions of victory that didn't require 8 seconds on the back of a bull named Bonecrusher. If this story already moved you, subscribe to the channel and leave your like to not miss any of our stories.